Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music's free, virtual, and very informal monthly series called Conversations with Our Curator. My name, if you don't know me, is Melissa Ziobro, and I am the Director of Curatorial Affairs for the Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music. Tonight, we are chatting with Craig Harris. Craig is a music historian, an educator, a storyteller, a photographer, a radio show host, a musician himself, truly a Renaissance man. And we are here tonight to discuss Craig's 2025 book, Last Waltz, the full story of the band. I am especially excited about this one because we are actually honoring the band at our sold out American Music Honors event later this month. So very, very timely here. Before we dive into chatting with Craig, just a few housekeeping details with apologies, as always, to our regulars who are here every month and have to hear me say this over and over again. But we really do always have different people registered month to month based on the book. And so this is my opportunity to take just a couple minutes and make sure everybody knows about all of the good work that the Springsteen Center is doing. If you are not super familiar with us, we are located on the campus of Monmouth University in West Long Branch, New Jersey, just a mile from the beach at the beautiful Jersey Shore. We're just up the road from famed Asbury Park. Our mission is really twofold. We preserve the legacy of Bruce Springsteen. We are his official repository, but we also celebrate the history of American music in all its diversity of artists and genres with our exhibits, our programming, our publications, and more. I get so excited about this because I am a longtime history educator. My background is actually in public history. I started as a historian, archivist, and curator for the Army, and then I moved into teaching. So I've been teaching history here at Monmouth University for 18 years. And believe it or not, there are some people who think history is boring. And that makes me so sad because if people think history is boring, it's probably just because it's been taught to them wrong. And they think that it's just about memorizing dates and facts and figures. And learning history is so much more than that. It's about understanding who we've been, how we got to where we are today, and how we can be our best possible selves as a citizenry going forward. And so if we want people to be informed about their history, we have to present it to them in accessible and engaging ways. And I think through this prism of music is one of the best ways we can do that. So very exciting mission we have here at the Springsteen Center. We are, if you're not aware, in the last phases of preparing a brand new building. It's a 30,000 square foot facility scheduled to open on the campus of Monmouth on June 7th. It will feature a 241 seat state-of-the-art theater, some 10,000 square feet of exhibits about Bruce, but also about American music more broadly, an archive for research, and so much more. So we can't wait to welcome you when we open our doors in something like 60 days. I don't know. There's a countdown timer on our website, which, is exciting for some, perhaps anxiety inducing for others, but I digress. Again, you'll want to visit our website, which is springsteencenter.org. You can learn about all of the wonderful events we've got going on virtually, on campus, off campus. And you can also donate on the website if you are so inclined, because we are, after all, a 501c3. So again, visit springsteencenter.org to stay abreast of all of the latest Springsteen Center for American Music news. Thank you for letting me introduce us to you a bit. And now we can get back into tonight's program. So, Conversations with Our Curator is this free monthly series that features researchers and writers who are exploring new perspectives in American music history. I really just wanted us to have some programming that was accessible to everyone at zero cost, regardless of where they were. So after some initial questions from me, we will open the floor to audience Q&A. And I like to keep these to no more than 1 hour. So we will wrap up promptly by 8 p.m. Eastern time. Okay, Craig, I swear I'm done rambling. Let's pivot to talk about you and your great book. So, first, I gave a brief bio, singing your praises as a true Renaissance man, but just tell us a little bit more about you and your background.
My ex-wife used to say, if I get cut, musical notes come out. I've been playing drums and percussion since I was a child, but the passion for something isn't enough. You need to have the knowledge to back it up. And fortunately, I had the gift to be able to write and do radio, to write and do radio. And that let me interview people. I've interviewed probably over 1,000 articles going back to 1971, and then wrote 8 or 9 books. I have a weekly radio show where I play music with the Gaia Star Band. That's distributed by the Dream Vision 7 radio network. And then I have a music show, a regular DJ show on Bluegrass Country out of Washington, D.C. bluegrasscountry.org or WAMU FM HD2 in Washington, D.C. And there I focus each week on one particular artist, or I have a theme for the next 3 weeks. It's going to be focusing for 3 hours each week on Willie Nelson. Um, I first saw the band in 1971 in Central Park. I had gone to the concert series, the Schaefer music series at Bowman Skating Rink. You can buy a ticket, a, a goods ticket, an orchestra ticket, a first level ticket for $2. The balcony up in the nosebleed bleed section was only $1. And then if you couldn't afford that, you could surround on the rocks. And I saw the band the second time that they played there. And what turned me into a fan was hearing Garth Hudson's intro to Chest Fever, which eventually became known as Genetic Method. And just being out in the cold, in the outside Central Park air and seeing the skyscrapers and hearing Garth play, I was hooked. I thought it was the greatest thing I've ever discovered. I got to see the band many times after that. Got to play a couple of times with Rick Danko, and we'll talk about that later. And then wrote a couple of books about the band. In 2014, the band Pioneers of Americana Music came out. And then this recent book, um, Last Waltz, the full story of the band, came out last year. So
Amazing, Craig. So that's a little bit about you and how you encountered the band. Let me ask you now, let's say one of my students is on here tonight and they've never heard of the band. Give us the briefest thumbnail overview of the band before we dive in greater detail.
the band were one of the pioneering garage rock bands that became Bob Dylan's band when Bob Dylan went from acoustic music to electric for the first time. And then the band afterwards took that music and laid the foundations of what's become Americana by incorporating folk, blues, rock and roll, a little bit of jazz. There was nothing that they didn't play, and it all became American music.
Now, there's an interesting caveat here, though. If, again, I'm sure we've got some lifelong fans of the band on the call, but there may be also people who do not realize all but one member of the band is Canadian, right? Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, it all begins with a man named Ronnie Hawkins, who was born in Fayetteville, Arkansas in 1935. He he was a character and a half. In writing this recent book, I had a chance to do one of his final interviews. Now, he was a character. Even as a kid, he made a lot of money because he ran moonshine from one state to the where it was illegal and sold it and made $1,000 a week. His father was a barber making something like $35 a day. Now, needed to take that money and hide it somewhat, or people would get suspicion of why such a kid has this much money. And he started investing in nightclubs. And he started performing. Excuse me. He went to college because his mom was a school teacher. And in that college, he studied swimming and acrobatics. He was known as Rompin' Ronnie. Well, after college, he didn't know what he was going to do next. And he was home, and he got a phone call. And well, after the army, after, after leaving school, he was in the army for 6 months because he had fulfilled the ROT requirements. One night he was at the AmVets club, and there was a black R&B band playing that was led by A.C. Reed, the saxophone player. Ronnie was so excited he jumped up on the stage, grabbed the microphone, and they were called the Black Hawks. They were one of the first integrated bands ever. After the army, they became the house band of this AmVets club. After the army, the woman who owned the club wanted to keep booking them, but you couldn't get gigs in the South back then for an integrated band, so they broke up. Ronnie didn't know what to do next. He went home, and after a couple of days, he got a phone call from Luke Paul, Paulman, Luke Perlman at Sun Records. They wanted him to come and be the front man for the studio band. He'd be paid $100 in room and board. And he jumped at the chance and was so excited he's going to Memphis to play with the big guys. Told all his friends, all his relatives, he was going to be a star. When he got to the place, to Sun Studios, the band had broken up. And Ronnie didn't know what to do. And he went with Luke back. Luke had just gotten married and was heading back home to Helena on the other side of Arkansas in the cotton area in the Delta. Um, and they formed Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks. They needed a drummer. So they remembered this 16-year-old kid named Mark Levon Helm, who had been playing mandolin and guitar with his sister for years at Rotary Club gigs and local gigs, church gigs, and had sat in one night playing drums. One day, Levon, as he was called, was on the family farm, and Ronnie Hawkins' Cadillac pulls up, and Ronnie Hawkins gets out and talks to him and asks him to be the drummer, and Levon brings him inside to meet his parents and get their permission. His parents wouldn't let him join any band and go anywhere until he graduated high school because he would be the first Helm to record. He would be the first Helm in the family to graduate high school. So they practiced and played local gigs on the weekend. Then they headed up to Canada. Conway Twitty, Harold, whose real name was Harold Jenkins, lived in that same area and told Ronnie Hawkins about all the success he had had since he moved up to Canada. So Ronnie Hawkins took the band, and as soon as Levon graduated, they headed up to Canada, where it took them a while to break in, but they really created a big scene and had a great club life. And as members of the group left, it eventually became the members of the band.
Mm.
Levon, of course, was the only one that came from Arkansas, but slowly Robbie Robertson, Richard Manuel, Rick Danko, and Garth Hudson became members of the band.
Why Canada, Craig?
Canada, there was no rock and roll scene at all in Canada. Canada was somewhat behind what was going on musically in the United States. It wasn't until the 60s that a law was passed that radio stations had to play 50% Canadian material. So everything was American.
That's so interesting. So
So
how,
it was an open scene. So when Ronnie Hawkins came up, it was such a new thing that they were able to get club work. They
hmm,
were they were a bar band, a rock and roll bar band. But Ronnie Hawkins worked them the way James Brown works a band, which meant after the gig was over, they had to practice for another few hours. And he laid down different laws and rules. He, they, they, Ronnie Hawkins wasn't that much older than them, and they couldn't play the good clubs because they weren't even drinking age yet. So they had to play what they could get. But they learned how to work on it as a band.
hmm. How formative were those early years backing Ronnie Hawkins, in shaping the sound and the discipline of the group?
It was important because it brought them together as a group. But it was and later on in later recordings that influence became greater. Like the album Moondog Matinee is all old cover tunes that could have been played by the Hawks.
Hmm.
But when they started recording on their own after playing with Dylan, they did a complete 180-degree turn. It wasn't a rock and roll album. It was everything against it was. There was it was a time of heavy metal and psychedelic music, and the band is anything but that. They are the complete opposite of that.
Tell us a
We,
bit then about how they go from being this bar band to working with Dylan.
oh, Dylan was in transition. He had recorded originally solo acoustic with his guitar and harmonica. When he recorded the album, bringing it all back home, half of that album is acoustic, half of it is electric. When he played at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965, it's a very complicated story, and I get very deep into it in the book. Um, but essentially, he winds up playing electric with a band that he puts together that day. and they get booed. And after that, there was no turning back. He couldn't go back to being a solo acoustic guitar player. He needed a band for the energy and kind of music that he wanted to play. And John Hammond, who recently passed away, the blues guitar player, had used the band on one of his solo albums recently and told Bob Dylan about this great band. There was also a woman from Toronto originally who worked in Albert Grossman, Bob Dylan's manager's office, and she was familiar with the Hawks and kept raving about them. So it piqued Bob Dylan's interest to try to do something with them. And he called them, and they were very skeptical. They didn't know how big someone played acoustic folk music could be. So they didn't really know what this guy was all about. It wasn't the music scene that they were plugged into. They
Mm.
were into black rhythm and blues and gospel music and black organ jazz.
Now, ultimately, they're going to leave Dylan, and that's when they gel around this name, the band. Talk to us a bit about how that happens.
Well, they didn't have a name for the band. They were just, well, after they left Ronnie Hawkins, they took the name Levon Helm, Levon and the Hawks. Occasionally, it was just the Hawks. When they played with Bob Dylan, it said on the flyer, on the posters, Bob Dylan and band. When they signed with Capitol Records to record and were getting ready to release music from Big Pink, they wanted to call themselves the Crackers, and Capitol Records turned that down. Eventually, they said we'll be the band because everybody calls them the band anyway. So that's how they became the band.
So the band's sound blends a lot of different traditions. We've discussed this a bit already, right? Folk, blues, country, Dixieland. How intentional was that? Or was it something that evolved more organically?
It evolved organically. They had just finished playing with Bob Dylan, which opened them up to the possibility of using lyrics in songs. They Good one, Ryan, and that's exactly why Capitol Records turned them down. Um, I got distracted. What was the question?
Well, we were just talking about their various influences, but we can pivot to the next question here, which is music from Big Pink, which you just referenced, comes out in 1968. But by 1976, they're already performing a farewell concert, right? Versus a band like, say, the E Street Band, that's been together for decades and decades. Um, I think one of the most enduring tensions for the band was around songwriting credits, right? Particularly involving Robbie Robertson. Talk to us a little bit about why the band, which enjoys this outside influence to this day, but why were they so relatively short-lived?
Um, on one hand, this story is wonderful. You like to say that they're the classic rock and roll band who had great success. On the other hand, three-fifths of the band were alcoholic and drug addicts who didn't know how to spend money, who thought that the money that they brought in from recording was there to just spend and have a good time with, which it is until you run out of it and you no longer have that success. On the other hand, Robbie Robertson, it's a matter of perspective because Robbie Robertson didn't grew up thinking that one man was his father, and it wasn't until his mother broke up with the man who was abusive to him that she even knew that he wasn't his father. His father was actually a Jewish gangster who he never met because he managed to get himself killed a few days before Robbie was born. Robbie grew up in the slums of Toronto, not the best part of the city at all. The only way he can get out of those slums was through music. Music wasn't for having fun and enjoyment. It was for seeing how far it could get you out and keep you out of those slums. The other guys grew up on farms, and they were used to bringing the fiddles out and the guitars out and the basses out late at night with the family and just playing for the joy of having music. So Robbie was very business oriented. When it came to the songwriting, that was a big problem. Robbie became a disciple of Albert Grossman. Albert Grossman was very aware that the money in music doesn't come from the performing or the recording, but it comes from the publishing. That's why Bob Dylan's songs were covered by everybody, because Albert Grossman went out there and hustled and got everybody to record Bob Dylan songs because he owned half the publishing, which is outrageous considering the industry standard. That's why Bob Dylan left Albert Grossman.
So there's obviously a lot of intergroup turmoil. How do you, as a historian, going back and trying to document this, handle conflicting accounts between the different group members, like, say, Robertson and Helm?
You have to give them each their own voice without putting your own value judgment on it. Let their own what they've said in the past, what they said in interviews, how they all fit together, and and then you make your own decision as the reader of it. Levon was very right. In fact, the reason I wound up writing this second book of the band, was my first book about the band came out in 2014. About 2015, I came home one night, and there on my answering machine was a phone message from Anna Lee Amsden, who's the Anna Lee who's mentioned in the song The Weight. Jesus was a childhood friend of Levon's. And she said, "You got it all wrong." Because at the very end, just as that book was going to print, Robbie Robertson went to visit Levon in the hospital. When he came out of the hospital, he made a statement. And in the statement, it made it sound like they had sat and talked and reconciled their long-standing hatred of each other. Annalie pointed out that they never reconciled because Levon was in a coma at the time. And even if he was awake, he wouldn't have reconciled. He would have gotten out, and as she told me, gotten out of bed and punched him in the face. But I swallowed the lie that Robbie Robertson told, like many people. And I wanted to write a book that told more about what actually happened. So I wound up talking, like I said, to Ronnie Hawkins and to managers and to Rick. I had already done interviews with Rick Danko and with Robbie Robertson. I did heavy duty research. There are over 1,000 cited quotes from newspapers and books from everywhere. And when you put it all together, there's your picture, there's your portrait. And
The
as
depth of research here is really amazing, Craig. And I have to ask, there are these conflicting accounts. You don't shy away from the darker aspects of this story, substance abuse, financial troubles, health issues, and yet you managed to do it very respectfully. I mean, you are an accomplished author. Bloomsbury is a highly respected academic press. Where's the balance, like, between telling the unvarnished story in a respectful and historically accurate way and not being salacious like the National Enquirer? How do you strike that balance?
Because you do it with respect. You do it with an understanding of what you're talking about. You don't go for yellow journalism.
Mhm.
You don't need to when it comes to history. You can tell the story accurately. Go for it with precision.
The turmoil that is such a big part of the band's story. Do you see that as typical of rock bands of the era, or was it uniquely intense?
It was uniquely intense. Not everybody. Richard Manuel was drinking since he was a teenager. He had a voice of an angel, but the soul of a devil. They found when they cleaned out his apartment in California, they found 400 empty bottles of Grand Marnier. When I played with Rick Danko, there was one night in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he played with a blues singer named Tony Medeiros, a buddy of his. And we were downstairs in the dressing room, and he wanted to teach Tony the harmony to a song and came nose to nose with Tony and drew the harmony out with such strength that I felt like I could take a knife and cut it. It was three-dimensional. On the other hand, everybody who came into the green room before he said hello, he asked them if he had anything to smoke. And he had just gotten out of rehab, and he had gone into rehab because he had gotten busted when his wife sent him heroin when he was in Japan. I mean, it's not a pretty story when you come down to it. It's wonderful, wonderful music, and the influence is heard in every Americana band, but the story is one that breaks your heart. Even Robbie Robertson at the very end, there's a lawsuit in which his supposed ex second wife, Janet Saffarini, um, used his money and wrote a will out after he was diagnosed with cancer. And he was doing heavy drugs that affected the way he thought and wrote it in such a way that his kids are responsible for paying the mortgage of this $6.5 million house and the upkeep for that house. So that it isn't pretty anywhere except for the music.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to pivot, Craig, and invite the audience to ask some questions. As usual, folks, if you have a question, you are welcome to unmute yourself and ask, or you can type it in the chat and I would be happy to read it for you. And Ryan was quickest to raise his hand. He even used the raise your hand function. So, Ryan, by all means, please ask the first question.
Hi, Craig. Thank you so much for this. I will be checking out your book. Um, as far as Levon is concerned, I think he's one of the most influential drummers in all of rock and roll. How would you describe his style? Where did that come from? Where would you rate his drumming?
Oh, he's very much a part of my drumming. And as I researched more and listened more, it became more a part of what I play. When I was a kid growing up playing drums, people used to tell me you ain't nothing until you find your backbeat. And I didn't quite know what that meant until I listened to Levon, and his left hand was very strong. He used his right hand for coloring, but that backbeat was strong and solid. And there's a lot of military drumming in what he does, marching band drumming. It's very precise.
Interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the question, Ryan. All right. You can type your questions in the chat or unmute yourself and just shout out. You don't even have to find the fancy raise your hand function. I am watching here. Oh,
See you, Paul.
Yeah, hi, Craig. Hi, Melissa. How are you?
hey, Paul.
Craig, on a lighter note, I'd like to see your thoughts on the mythology of Big Pink and how that's taken on this uninvited tourist spot for people up in the Woodstock area. It's kind of taken a life of its own now, or has been for years.
So does Woodstock altogether. I went to school in New Paltz, which is half an hour. It's our college. It's the college near Woodstock. We would just, and I was there about a year ago, and it doesn't even look the same from when it looked like when I was there. There's a lot more stores, a lot more commercialism. Big Pink is what Big Pink is, but I'll tell you, when I went to Big Pink, I could feel the spirit. And whether it's coming from inside of me or whether it was real, it doesn't matter. I felt the significance of it. I knew what I was looking at. And I felt that I would like to be in the basement there playing.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Here's a question in the chat from Josie. Josie says, I always say that everything I know about collaboration, good and bad, I learned from the band. How likely is it that we will hear another band with the same level of skill and interaction?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think the Beatles are up there equally. Every part of that machine works. I haven't seen a band myself that is that exact, where every part of the machine is important. That there's a reason that they were called the band more than just being on the flyer. They lived up to the name. That's why there's a T in front of the. They are the quintessential everything.
Thanks for that question. This is a bit of a specific one, Craig, so let's see what you make of it. Question from Paul. Do you agree that much of the band's early impact and mythology was aided not just by the music, but by the photography of Elliot Landy?
Yes, but not only Elliot Landy. I'm very proud to say that my good buddy David Garr shot the photo on the cover of the book. So David Garr was there equally as important. But Elliot Landy, I don't know if he had any notoriety before the band. They hired him not because he was known as the best photographer, but the opposite. Everything I've read was that they weren't looking for the best photographer. His photographs definitely captured a scene and gave a good part to that mythology. I mean, music for Big Pink opens up to a gatefold with the whole family, and then that's very contrary to the older people generation that we were going through at the time. There wasn't a generation gap there. They were embracing the music of their elders, and that's something that hadn't really been done quite before. There wasn't anybody looking at roots music back then. It was right after they had created roots music.
Here's a question in the chat from Janet. Craig, did you get a chance to see the Last Waltz tribute tour in 2024 with Mike Campbell and Benmont Tench of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, among other wonderful musicians? If so, what did you think?
I thought it was wonderful. I didn't get to see it, but I've heard recordings of it. And if anyone wants to find a recording of it, it's available at sugarmegs.com. And anytime anybody's done a song by the band, they've done it well because the songs are written so precisely well. There's only one I can't listen. I had to listen to Islands, but boy, that's a chore and a half.
Thanks for that question, Janet. Here is a question from Stu in the chat. How did Todd Rundgren manage the production of Stage Fright?
Very well, I think he did. I think that they could have used some experienced head in there, at least in the very beginning.
Okay. Here's a question from me. Thought of another one that I had in reserve here. What lessons can modern bands learn from the experience of the band?
Working together, they can learn from the abuse what to stay away from. They can learn that songwriting agreements have to be made in advance and that the business has to be handled like a business and not just a good time.
Here's a question from Steven in the chat. Can you provide some insight on why Martin Scorsese chose The Last Waltz as a project?
Well, they chose him. And they chose him primarily because Jonathan Taplin, who had been their road manager, was the producer of Mean Streets. So they knew of Martin Scorsese. Martin Scorsese and Robbie had an agreement that was another reason why the band fell apart. According to many reports I got, the way it was explained to me was the band was on Capitol Records. The Last Waltz album and movie came out on Warner Brothers. Now, how did that happen? because it was a contract with not the band, but with Last Waltz Productions. And who was Last Waltz Productions? You'd think the band was part of that. It was Robbie and Martin. The band was paid a one solid fee for their participation in the film. And Robbie and Martin, every time that film is redone, every time it's reissued, they make money. So Robbie was very smart business-wise. You can't blame him for that, but you don't treat your friends like that. And then, is it a business or is it a club? Is he wrong for doing things, dotting the I's and crossing the T's? I used to think that Levon had a very strong case, but I could see both sides of it very much now.
That's interesting, of course, as immersed in the material as you are. Here's a question from Paul. When was the interview footage of The Last Waltz, not the music, filmed? Had Robbie stopped performing with the rest of the band at that point?
Yes, that was shot afterwards. Levon hated to go there and he didn't participate in that at all. He went back home and worked on his Bond studio. So yes, it was done afterwards. As was the recording with the Staple Singers and Emmylou Harris. That was done afterwards.
If someone is new to the band, Craig, what are the top 3 songs you'd recommend that they listen to?
I'll tell you, there was one time where I did a book signing thing, an author event in a predominantly African American neighborhood. And I was the only white person on the stage talking about books. I knew if I started talking about the band, they'd have no idea what I'd be talking about. And I said, pulled into Nazareth, was feeling about. And they knew instantly because everybody records that song. Aretha Franklin, the Staple Singers. So they know. So I would say that. I would say Up on Cripple Creek, which was their big hit. And I would say Stage Fright.
Everybody, hope you wrote that down. Here's a comment from Josie in the chat. That version of Old Time Religion is just a killer display of their musicality in 90 sections. Best interview in The Last Waltz, in my opinion. Thoughts, Craig?
They were musically aware. As kids, they took away, there's something, Claire Channel radio stations. You could pick up a radio station in New York, across the border in America. They were listening to stations out of Nashville, out of Chicago. They were hip to what the music was. They was they knew what they were talking about.
Now, as we come to the end of our time together this evening, I want to note that your great book carries this story forward well past The Last Waltz and the original lineup. Why was it important to you to do that, to continue it past The Last Waltz?
Because the story was the full story of the band. I wanted to get the whole story from Ronnie Hawkins all the way up to the final breath. But I got to see both versions of the band, and they were very different. After they came back together, after Rich's passing, they were much more of a Roadhouse Blues band than Before that, they were the Great American Folk Band. They also solved the problem later on in that they were loud enough. When they first started, they kept their sound relatively low considering the times, which was the big problem in Woodstock. They were in between 10 years after Red Mountain, and the audience was going to sleep.
Mhm.
But I loved this second version of the band. They were rockers.
All right. Anybody have a last question? You're welcome to unmute yourself and shout out. Okay, then I'm going to leave the last word with you, Craig. Last thoughts on this book.
Say that again.
The floor is yours for any last thoughts that you would like to share before we wrap up.
Well, tune into my radio show Friday evenings, bluegrasscountry.org, or drop me a line and I'll put you on the weekly mailing list, craigharrismusic@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to keep you abreast of what's going down. A lot of exciting things are coming up.
Amazing. I just dropped that email in the chat. So if anybody wants to continue the conversation with Craig, you can do that. Otherwise, we're going to wrap up and you are all going to go order Last Waltz, the full story of the band by Craig, 2025 Bloomsbury Press. This has been wonderful, Craig. Thanks for telling us a little bit about the history and legacy of the band, as you noted, capital T. The band, of course, as I noted at the outset, getting a special posthumous honor at the Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music's American Music Honors later this month. Again, keep in touch, springsteencenter.org. We want to see you on campus, off campus, and virtually every which way. Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you, Craig. Have a
Thank
great
you.
night.
Thank you, and have a wonderful night.